Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. In March 2022, just as things were getting back to normal post-COVID in Birmingham, some hateful racist literature was being distributed across the city. For Muz, this was all of the racist bullying of her childhood raising its ugly face again, this time by a group called the Patriotic Alternative. Muz nervously reached out to her predominantly white neighbours through the WhatsApp group, and to her immense relief she realised that they were as disgusted as she was about this spreading of hate. A few conversations later, this community came together and quickly removed the oxygen from the haters and started the group Brummies United against racism and hate crime. On the podcast, Muz shares the heartbreaking stories of racism experienced throughout her life, the impact that these have had on her, how it shaped her career, and in particular how the work of Brummies United has evolved. Unfortunately, fear of others is a currency that some politicians prey on. We also spoke about the rise of Nigel Farage and his Reform Party in the UK. Let's hear it from Muz. Hello Muz, how are you keeping?
I'm good, thank you, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast.
I'm so honoured and so privileged to have you on the Win Happy podcast because of the work that you do and your decision to take things into your own hands about things that you don't like and things that you don't see in your community. So for the listeners, you're the co-founder of Brummies United against racism and hate crime. And while we can all be against those horrible things, to actually take action and put yourself in the eye of the storm and start standing up and trying to make a difference. Sometimes it's easy for the haters to get very, very motivated around their hate and the subject of their hate. And in the reverse, sometimes it's not so easy to dig in against some of those things. And I really admire you because you did that with your neighbours, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Before we get into all that, I'd like the listeners to get to know you a little bit, if that's okay. And the very first thing I guess we should probably put out there is your name and why I'm not introducing you by your full name. And it's really, really sad that that's the case. But you might just explain that for the listeners, why I haven't introduced you by your full name.
So I've asked you not to introduce me by my full name just because I don't want to become the target of violence as a result of the campaigning we do. I'm really conscious that, particularly racial violence has risen across my city and people living in fear, but also because of the campaigning we do, I and others are worried about becoming target of far-right violence. And just on the outskirts of my city, 2 women have been raped in racist violence. So as a woman, I also fear that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Where did you grow up? Where are you from?
So I'm originally from Sheffield, the Steel City, as I say, up north. Yeah, so I grew up there in the 70s. And my parents are originally from Pakistan, so my dad worked in the steel industry, the foundries actually. So I used to see the miners march across my city centre, fighting for mines, and they were interesting times.
Yeah, I'm thinking, of course, of Full Monty immediately.
Yeah.
Your dad wasn't a character in that movie or anything?
No, he wasn't. No, he used to work night shifts actually in factories. So he had very little time for TV. He used to sleep in the day and then work in the evenings. So he passed away 6 months ago.
I'm sorry.
So someone is lost, but, I learnt a lot about resilience through my parents.
Yeah, that movie and how it depicts Sheffield and the industrial revolution, I guess, or the opposite, whereby people are displaced suddenly because those industries couldn't sustain themselves anymore. Was that film fairly accurate about Sheffield or a particular aspect of it?
I think so. People in Sheffield are really warm, and they have grit and determination despite everything. And, I remember in the 70s, it was really harsh. I remember National Front marching through our streets. But I also remember, as a young person, seeing, the labour movement fight back and organise. And there was still warmth and community despite the deprivation. So I think there's a lots of elements of that film that has a lot of truth. And yeah, Sheffield people, we're just full of grit and determination, and we fight back.
Yeah. And I think none of that left you a whole pile. I think you have all of that grit and determination. Your mum and your dad coming from Pakistan, at what stage of their lives would they have been when they landed in the UK?
I think my dad was in his late 20s. And basically, as what happened with a lot of colonies, because of shortage of labour here, people from the Commonwealth were invited to fill certain jobs. So my father came, and he ended up in Sheffield. At that time, my mother didn't come, and my mother came a few years later. And he did, before he passed, he told me the stories of the discrimination he faced when he was working, and actually the lack of union lights. So my father, he lost 2 fingers in an industrial accident, but he didn't get any compensation. He had asbestos in his lungs, and that made it really difficult for him. But again, if there were no rights at that time for workers, and so we should be really glad that we have unions that have fought for those rights. And if that had happened now, obviously my dad would have been compensated for his injuries. But then it was seen as part and parcel of the risk you take when you work. So it was tough. He did tough manual labour, and then he came here in the time when it was really hard to get jobs. It was hard to get housing. It was very commonplace to have, racist posters on people's windows that said things like, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. So they found it really hard to rent as well at that time.
Yeah, and it's ironic. How many years later? Are we talking 50 years later? And you're witnessing all of the same.
Yeah, I mean, so my dad and mum didn't send me to the inner city school that my older brother and sister went to, because they said it wasn't a very good school. So they sent me to a school on the outskirts of Sheffield. And I was one of the first Asians or black child in the school. And I was known as Packet Instand. That was my nickname at school. And I experienced so much racism. I actually hated my parents for sending me to that school because of, being bullied every single day. And not only from my peers, but also teachers were really racist. And I grew up, feeling othered, but also not just because of my race, but also because I was from the inner city and we lived in really small homes. My dad was a factory worker, and I went to a school where the houses were, the houses were really big. My peers, their parents were, one of them I discovered was my dad's ENT consultant. So they were middle class and they had big houses. I'd never seen houses this big before. And so I learned, that there were people that had things and lived, well off. And then there was us that lived, in poverty and struggled. And that was an eye-opener for me as well. So I learned not only about, racism, but also, other forms of inequality.
Children are very cruel. I think there's nothing worse than if you have glasses or if you have a disability, even a limp, or if you have weird hair, you're a target for ridicule by any of the school children. But obviously racism is a particular way to be targeted. For you as a a young woman, a young girl, trying to survive in school against all of this racism. How did you cope? And at any point, did things change as, once people started to get to know you and like you and all of that?
I think my school shaped who I am because of experiences. When I remember in my second year, a lad joined our class, and he had been expelled from other schools. He was a skinhead, and he wore Doc Martens, and his brother was a member of the National Front. And he claimed to be a member of the National Front, and every single day he'd tell me he was going to find out where I lived and burn my house down. And I was so scared. I spent a lot of time hiding in toilets. I was beaten up and bullied, and I'd have, if I complained to the teachers, like they'd never do anything. And I remember two brothers, twins, Alex and Dominic. I still remember their names. They'd always bully me, and I reported them, and they came back to me and they said, "Oh, we didn't get told off about what we said to you. We got told off about not tying our shoelaces." And I think that taught me is like, teachers don't care. This is like what I'm going to have to suffer. And I just put my head down, like I said. And then I think a number of things changed. By the time I got into the sixth form, actually just before I got into sixth form, I had a parents' evening, and I had an economics teacher who was so racist. And because my dad worked in a factory and my mum doesn't speak fluent English, my older brother went to a parents' evening with my mum. And the following day, when we were in the class, my economics teacher turned around to me in front of the whole class and said, "Do you marry your brothers?" And I was really, really embarrassed. And I just my eyes filled in tears. And all of the kids laughed at me. And I just didn't understand why he, said that. And I came home and I was telling my brother, because I never told my parents anything, because I blamed them for sending me to that school. So no matter how much I was being bullied, but I was talking to my brother and telling him how this teacher had said this. And my dad overheard. And the following day, I was leaving school and my dad was walking into school. I was really shocked. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, I heard you telling your brother what was said." He said, "I'm not having it." And so he went into school and he challenged the teachers, and the teacher denied saying that. But my dad said, "I trust my daughter, and you lot might marry your brothers, but we don't do that. And how dare you say these kind of things?" And I think that gave me some confidence, because I felt my father was sticking up for me. And then I refused to do my A-level economics with that teacher. So when I got to sixth form, he had taught me at GCSE, but when I got to sixth form, I actually did economics in another school. I used to travel to another school to do economics because I refused to be taught by him. And also then in sixth form, the Sheffield Education Authority introduced multiculturalism as a policy. And because I was one of the senior pupils at the school, they asked me to talk to the other children of colour in the school to find out what their experiences were. And actually what I did was I kind of brought all of them together, because by this time there had been, other younger children from black and brown families that joined. And we formed Black Students Against Racism. And we formed that in the memory of a boy who'd been killed in Manchester. His name was Ahmed Iqbalullah, and he was stabbed to death in a Burnage school. And I read about this case, and we formed this society in his names, and we named all the racist teachers in our school and all the incidents and a list of demands. And those demands were, we want, racist name calling to be taken seriously. We want to be taught our history in a positive light, because history was taught, it was very much, the empires were presented as something really positive, and our countries were presented as underdeveloped, when actually, if you read history, trillions were stolen from the global south. So we had a list of demands, and what happened was our society got banned straight away. And so we didn't task you with that. We just wanted to understand people, the experiences of the children. So but they wouldn't let us meet. But that for me, that was an act of defiance. And we would, secretly meet in the playground and still support each other. And also, I think it was really important that we did it in the memory of Ahmed Iqbalullah, because we knew that this was happening across the country to other children, and schools weren't taking, responsibility. And also in the background, my brother, who's a bit older than me, who I mentioned, he has started the Asian youth movement, because the National Front were marching through our streets and the police weren't defending communities. So he then set up the Asian youth movement, and they started really defending communities against racial violence.
That was your school life. What was home life like?
Home life was, I saw my parents struggle a lot. Like I said, my dad, worked in a factory, and my mum stayed at home. There were 5 of us. We didn't have a car. And so, we'd go shopping with mum. I went to appointments with my parents because my mum, English was very good. It was tough. I felt othered. I felt different. There were times when I wished I was white because it was really difficult. But then there was a lot of love in the home. And my parents, like I said, taught me resilience because I watched them struggle. And despite everything, my dad told me the story when I was born and he was working and my mum had stayed up all night with me. I was really, really ill. So she took me to the doctor's surgery and she sat all day and, in the surgery waiting for the doctor to see me. And the doctor refused to see me. And so she brought me home and she told my dad, and my dad took me to hospital. And I was treated in hospital. And then he took the doctor to court for racism, for racial discrimination. And my dad won that case against the GP. And the judge said to my dad, "What do you want?" And he said, "I don't want anything apart from an apology." And for him, not to treat any other Muslim family or Pakistani family the way they've treated my family. That's who my dad was. He was someone who was resilient. He was tough, but he just wanted justice. He didn't want anything more than justice. And I think that's what he's taught us.
What was your dad's name?
It's called Munsab.
Munsab. So as a young adult, finding your way in the world, having experienced horrible discrimination and racism, your view of social circles and who to mix with and who not to mix with, if you're going into further education or a new school, or even looking at circles of friends, other young women living in your neighborhood and that, would you automatically not go near any social situation where you think you're going to get racism? And I suppose in a roundabout way, I'm really saying, would you avoid even mixing with white children just in case you're going to get more shit?
No, when you're young, you want friends.
Yeah, of course.
So I was looking for friends, but I think because I was different from, at school, it was really difficult to make friends. I didn't live locally. I lived, in the inner city. The school was on the outskirts, so it wasn't, couldn't get together after school. And just because, like I said, it's like we just couldn't relate to each other. And because of my experience of racism, I think I became quite a bit of a loner. So growing up, I really didn't have many friends in Sheffield, and my friendship started when I came to university. Because I came to study in Birmingham. And when I came to Birmingham, because Sheffield in the 70s, 80s was very white, I came to Birmingham and it was far more multicultural. And I found people who looked like me, who I could relate to, had similar experiences. And and I've not left the city because of that. And I felt like I belong, and I was able to develop friendships and networks. And yeah, for me, it's been really important having that, because those experiences in Sheffield growing up were really lonely. I mean, we had family, and we had, friends of the family, but not, not growing up did I have friends. And my schooling experience was really, really negative.
Why are we so afraid of people who are different? What is it in our psyche that has some people behaving in horrible ways? As you got to know people as an adult and everything, and maybe you've even witnessed people transforming in front of you, people who have they got to know you and discovered, ooh, Moses is quite a normal person after all. What was I afraid of, or what was I so weird about? Have you seen that transformation in the people you mix with? People who were in this kind of weird, ignorant place, and suddenly they transform as they just get to know you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we judge people from a distance. We hear things about communities, and I think naturally, even as a child, when you see people that don't look like you, children stare, but aren't told, it's okay to go and ask a person about their difference. And I think children, naturally want to make friends. But if they're being taught, that, oh, that person's different, and, and you shouldn't approach them, or you should be friends with them, or create negativity around a certain community, then that's going to create fear in children. And so they won't mix, even though it's very, very natural for children to want to play together. But I think when you break down those barriers and you relate to people at a heart level, actually you find that people have so much in common. I mean, not long ago, I was doing a series of workshops called Breaking Bread and Boundaries, where I was inviting people from across different communities come and break bread with each other, to sit in a restaurant, enjoy a free meal, and just talk to somebody that you've not met before. And we were encouraging really difficult conversations in those spaces, which was like, what is your fear of the other community? And it was really, really interesting, listening to these conversations. For instance, I had organised a workshop between the Eastern European communities and Asian communities after Brexit, because I was really shocked that an area that I was working in, Handsworth, which was predominantly black and brown communities, they voted for Brexit, and I was being told that the far right had been leafleting homes of, communities, saying that if you don't vote for Brexit, Eastern Europeans will come and take your jobs. And so it's trying to pit, communities against each other. And so I brought together Eastern European communities and the black and brown communities of Handsworth to come and share a meal and talk about their concerns. And it was really interesting. I remember an Asian woman saying, oh, some Polish men have moved onto our street, and, every time I walk past them, they're drinking in the front garden, and I feel intimidated. And the Polish men said, we're not trying to intimidate you. In Poland, culturally, we sit in our front gardens and we enjoy a beer. And that's what we do. And there were a group of Romanians, and they said, we would love you to come into our shops, but we don't make small talk. We'll never talk about the weather because it's not part of our culture. So don't, interpret that as being rude. We just don't do that. And it was just really interesting. And what came out of that was a much more greater understanding of each other and also each other's fears. I mean, people heard about how some of the Polish community find it really difficult to get housing. And these were the experience of Asian communities. And now a new community are experiencing some of the racism and the othering that historically in the 60s and 70s, Black and Asian communities were experiencing. And so what we tried to do was get people to relate at a heart level and to understand that actually, we have the same fears for all our kids, for ourselves. And when we look at the root causes of the problems, it's not each other. It's a system, that creates poverty. It's a system that didn't create the jobs. And what we need to do is unite to change the system that doesn't represent our interests, because ultimately we are the ordinary people who are collectively struggling.
And of course, when things are going wrong for people, we always like someone to blame, don't we? And, you spoke about fear. And I do think something that's crept into the world, it's always been there, but for some reason, in the last decade, politicians in particular, some politicians, fear is a currency that they've decided to use and weaponize. And I think Donald Trump, he copped onto that very quickly. Yeah, fear is the currency that I need to use, and be it climate change or immigration or whatever. I'm going to scare the living daylights out of everyone. And, all the horrible things that he's no issue about saying. And I think people have watched this and politicians have watched this and that they've just copied him, really. Nigel Farage over there, let's just copy Donald Trump. He's been a racist, and it's proven ever since he was a young student years and years ago. He hasn't changed, but for some weird reason, that's come into vogue with a lot of sections of our communities. So we like someone to blame, and when you have politicians who are quite happy to just harness all of that, then you get all of this ugliness. The young Muzz, finding your way in the world, you're now in Birmingham, you're starting to feel like I'm at home here, there's other people who are like me. In terms of your life and career, what path did you choose?
So after I graduated, I studied in Birmingham. I actually ended up in Manchester and got my first job working for Oldham Council. And that was an interesting job because I started working in the housing department as a research assistant. But it was at a time when Oldham City Council had been served a writ by the Commission of Racial Equality because one of their workers had whistleblown and said that Oldham was creating apartheid estates. So they were putting white families in the better housing and Asian families in the worse housing. And at that time, you had the way the housing was distributed is you'd have housing officers that worked on a patch and they'd control the patch. It's a very different system now. And so I didn't know this at the time when I joined, but this writ had been served and it was hanging over the housing department. And so they were given notice to almost sort that out. So I joined, fresh out of university, went to university, or started I studied sociology. Now, if anybody knows sociology, is it is like you learn about societal issues and power and change and movements. And I became an activist at university, so I joined a lot of protests and really kind of learned about racism and gender oppression and came out of it, kind of wanting to fight all forms of injustice. And then I ended up, as a research assistant in Oldham when the department was responding to this allegation of creating apartheid states. And what I saw was the way the council and officers, particularly housing officers, were responding to that was, we're going to show them. And the way they showed them was they started putting Black and Asian families in the middle of white housing estates. So you can imagine you've got a big housing estate that's looking, on itself, mainly, 1 or 2 bedroomed flats. So you've got a lot of single men, white single men on that estate. And there's a row of houses where they put Asian or Black families in. And every night, the community would gather and they'd petrol bomb the houses, attack those families. And I began seeing and hearing this. And when I raised it with the department and my managers, they said, well, we were told by the Commission for Racial Equality we can't segregate. So we're putting families in there. And we were going to show them. So I started keeping a dossier of evidence, and I wrote a report. And the director said to me, who's asked you to write this report? This is not your job. Your job is to collect information about the homeless stats in the city. So I began doing that because I just thought, it's like someone needs to know about this. This is the way the council are responding. And I found it really, really depressing. I found it, the fact that council could do this. And I remember meeting a Bengali woman who had 4 children. She had left her husband. She survived domestic abuse, so she was made homeless. And the council placed her in this estate, white estate, and she was petrol bombed and attacked. Her son had a snooker cue pushed down his ear, so he became deaf in one ear. And I went out to speak to her, and she said to me, I would rather be a victim of domestic abuse than be a victim of racial abuse. And she went back to her husband because of the way the council had housed her, knowing full well that this was happening on the estates. And I left at that point because I just I knew I couldn't change that system, that I was, powerless. And I actually became a racial harassment officer for Manchester Council. And so, full time was dealing with tackling, racial violence and supporting families and trying to develop multi-agency working in the city of Manchester to create pathways for people who's experiencing racial violence, and also to get the agencies to respond to it.
And you've continued to do that up until today, have you?
No, from there I became a women's safety officer, so I worked for Manchester looking at strategies against violence against women. And I think, that was, for me, I think all forms of oppression are linked. And I certainly learned from my own politics is that, it's the same, you mentioned Nigel Farage, you mentioned Trump. It's the same interest groups that oppress, not just, people of colour, but women, LGBT communities. We have a common enemy, and that only by uniting are we going to defeat those. And so for me, working on issues around violence against women and other equality issues, is really important. And so a lot of the work I've done is really at that community level, working in communities and bringing communities together. So I've worked in various, since leaving Manchester, I came back to Birmingham and I worked in various community organisations, bringing communities together and challenging different forms of oppression, but doing that grassroots work. And I think what I've learned is we have to start at real basic community level and bring people together at that heart level in order to challenge injustice, and not only in their local communities, but wider injustices in community. And currently I work for a big national charity as a housing campaigner, and I work with people affected by the housing crisis, of people stuck in bed and breakfast rooms or homeless families. And I work with them to help them fight for housing justice and help them understand it's not migrants taking their homes, it's that we've had years and years of underinvestment in social housing. And because of the failure of governments to build social housing and instead, the protecting the interests of private developers who are building luxury apartments, which we don't need, and people can't afford, that is the root cause. And so we're organising around those issues instead of blaming migrants. And that's been really, working at that level. I really value that work because we have people now who understand that and are fighting for the rights of migrants, and they're homeless themselves, but they understand that the reason why they're in bed and breakfast is not because of a migrant. It's because we have politicians that don't care about homeless people, and that housing, homelessness is a political project. It could be fixed by politicians, but they're refusing to fix it.
Yeah, when you're looking for votes, you're typically not chasing the vote of that homeless person, and they don't have a voice. If they had a voice, then maybe change could come about. When you look back through the different decades, and we take that topic of racism in the UK, have you noticed a change? Are there particular events where it's got worse or better? Since those early days for you.
I think it's definitely changed and it's got worse. Growing up in the 70s in Sheffield, we knew what the racists looked like. They were skinheads. They wore Doc Martens. Now, because of the language used by politicians, and that includes the Labour Party and Reform, where, people have been diminished to being called small boats. Migrants are being called small boats. And rather than understanding that there are people fleeing persecution and seeking asylum, we refer to them as small boats. We've lost our humanity. And the language that's being used has become so commonplace that neighbours feel emboldened to say things to their neighbours. So, it's harder to spot the racist. It can be your neighbour. It can be the person walking down the street. And we, in Brummies United, we've had people say to us, like, we don't know who to trust. We don't know whether our neighbours hold these views. And it feels that the narrative has changed so much, that the country's moved so much to the far right, that things that we wouldn't imagine being said right now. I mean, in the last week or so, Reform was talking about rounding up tens of thousands of migrants and putting them in camps. That's frightening. It's frightening for me to hear that. And I know I've spoken to people and they are saying that they're really fearful for their families because of the increase in racist attacks and the incidents, and because of the language. They fear a pogrom. And, I know, including people in my own family who've said, the what if? What if they come after us? Is it safe? Where would we escape to? Who can we trust? And I think that's why our poster campaign was really important, because I know on my street, my neighbours have got the posters up. I know I could trust them.
That empowerment, I agree with you. It's when you hear the likes of Trump saying all of those horrible things that you would never say to anyone out loud, even down to mocking people with disabilities and everything, people from shithole countries, Somalis eating their pets and all this rubbish. It actually gave people permission to say some of the shit in their heads that they shouldn't even be thinking. It gave them permission to say the things out loud just because these idiots were saying it. So you're in Birmingham, you're busy going about your work. COVID has knocked on everyone's doors. We're starting to emerge from COVID. It's March 2022. And you start getting flyers through your door from this weirdly named organization. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so like you said, I think COVID, because of COVID, our street set up a WhatsApp group. And, I'm sure there were lots of streets up and down the country who were on WhatsApp groups and then sharing things with each other. And it's lovely because it was a way of really, people live quite isolated lives. They don't mix with neighbours, but COVID brought us all out. And we were all like banging our pans for the NHS and those kind of things. But then one morning, I woke up to a message on my street WhatsApp, and it was from a neighbour who lives opposite me. And he said, "Oh, just a warning, this vile leaflet's been thrown onto my driveway, and if you've also received it, I suggest you just bin it." And obviously, I'm quite inquisitive about what was said on the leaflet. So I went out and found this little rolled up flyer on my driveway. And when I opened it, I was so angry and upset with the content. because I live on a street where most of my neighbours are white. And so I was thinking, like, I wonder how they will interpret this. But basically, the leaflet was from a far-right group called Patriotic Alternative. And they were blaming all the problems in our city on migrants, from housing to NHS to even traffic problems. And I just thought, there they go again, to blaming us for everything and trying to create division between me and my neighbours. And also they're talking about, England becoming a majority, and white people will become minorities in this country. So that kind of fear-mongering. And like I said, I work with people affected by the housing crisis. I understand, who makes up street homelessness. And I can say that veterans are not among street homeless people in our city. Very, very few veterans are. But, hearing this language of veterans and who is deserving. And I know, and every single day I work to change the root causes of the housing crisis and, lobby politicians to tackle those issues. And so I just thought, I am a community organiser and I organise and campaign. But actually what I need to do is get my neighbours to be equally angry about this leaflet. And so I kind of went back on the street WhatsApp and I said, look, I've seen this leaflet, I'm really upset about it, and what is everybody else thinking? And what came out of that was something I'm really proud of. Out of that, that conversation came of neighbours saying, they're also really angry, they're really upset, this can't happen. And so one of the neighbours came up with this idea of like, well, let's send them a message. And so we came up with this idea of a poster in our windows. And so if they came back on our street, they would see that we're all united against racism. But we decided that we weren't going to just say we're against racism, that we wanted to stand against all forms of hate in our city. So that's how Brummies United Against Racism and Hate Crime was born. And the irony of it is Patriotic Alternative tried to create division, but it actually brought us together. And it was the first time where I know, because of the campaigning, I went into some of my neighbours' homes. They came to my home. We'd not, mixed in that way before. And I'm really grateful because, I have, neighbours on my street that have had the posters up in their window since it began. And since starting the campaign, I visited Bosnia and I learnt about the genocide in Bosnia and how neighbours became each other's enemies and torturers, and how, neighbours would, I don't know how much your listeners will know about the genocide in Bosnia, but it became, Christians and Muslims were massacred. But they talked, when I went there, I learned the history of the genocide and how it was neighbours turning on each other. And when I came back here and I thought about that, it made me realise I know which one of my neighbours would protect me if they came after Muslims, as they are. Muslims have become the bogeyman and the enemy within. I know which one of my neighbours would hide me because they've got the posters up. And that, and the posters, we developed the posters, but neighbouring streets then started asking us for the posters. And then, our local councillors, we reached out to them and they agreed to distribute them in the neighbourhood. So we've had them in the local library, some shops took them through from there, where, we've got lots of our local streets, lots of neighbours with posters. And it was really heartening to see that. And people saying to us, the wonderful posters, where can we get copies from? So we've been printing them left, right and centre.
And in a way, there's so many things with that Muzz. It must have been a big moment for you to reach out to your white neighbours. I'm sure you did that quite nervously, trying to test the water just to see. You were obviously expressing how upset you were, but it was testing the water as well just to see what their reaction was. Did it surprise you?
It did, yeah. But also, no, because, I'd seen the care during COVID, but still, I suppose because I carry that trauma of my childhood, of, not people not standing by me. And so you're absolutely right. It was like I was almost testing the waters, like, I'm wondering what everyone else is thinking, because obviously it hits differently. When those leaflets are talking about you, the way I will read that as somebody maybe white will read that, it's going to be a different kind of reading of it. And also, how much people want to respond to that, because I always say that it takes good people to do nothing for evil to take hold. And so my neighbours are good people, and there are a lot of good people. And what we're trying to do with this campaign is get good people to do something, because if good people don't do anything, we are heading for some really dark times, and it feels like we're in those dark times, but they're going to get worse. So that's why we're using our example as neighbours to try and get those good people to kind of think, okay, it's time for me to do something. And even a simple act of putting up a poster, I can't express to you what that means to somebody. We had a Muslim woman saying to us, she wears headscarf and her area is heavily flagged. The union flag is everywhere. And she said to us, she wished, in her area, people had the posters, because then she would know who in her area is an ally, because she feels so isolated. And even on her street, because she's new onto the street, she doesn't know what her neighbours think of her, because the fear is, with all this racist rhetoric, is everybody hates us. Everybody doesn't want us here. Everybody is blaming us. And so the posters show us where the allies are.
Like in the same way that the stupid things that Trump and Farage would say, giving permission to idiots to just say those things out loud that they may not have said them beforehand. In a way, your movement has given people a vehicle to say the opposite. It's giving them a very tangible way to say, hey, neighbour, you don't have to be suspicious of me. I love you being my neighbour, and I hate what these idiots are doing, and I'm on your side. And without that, the voices of the idiots seem to get louder and louder and louder. And yet, people who totally disagree, I think a lot of the time we just don't have a vehicle like Brummies United and your organisation to express that in a very tangible way. Every community, in a way, needs to have those posters and say, no, we love you being our neighbour, and please knock on the door, and don't be suspicious of me when you're walking past my garden or my front door. We're happy to say hello, and you don't have to be suspicious, which is amazing, which is wonderful. So the experience since then, I think it was September 2022 that you finally had that movement going with the posters and everything, and the types of activities that you've engaged in since then. And I know you've got some really positive publicity as well, which is what triggered me to reach out to you. And thank you so much for taking my email and everything else. Besides those posters and that beautiful way that people can demonstrate the support, what are the other kind of tangible things that have happened since then?
So we've been distributing posters, and we've been saying that's like a really easy way to show allyship, that you stand against racism and all forms of hate. But then fast forward in, I think, August 2024, when the far-right riots happened across the country after Southport, we then, and some of the offers affected our city, and we could see the racial tension rise. So we then reached out to Birmingham City Council and, told them about our poster campaign, how it was, neighbours coming together. And we also contacted our local newspaper, who officially endorsed our campaign. So they actually created a pull-out poster in the local newspaper so people could access it and support. So we had the support of the local newspaper. And other organisations then jumped on to wanting supporters. So at the time, I think about 24 organisations kind of said they want supporters. City Council officially endorsed our campaign as well. And that was really important for us because what that enabled us to do then grow as a citywide campaign. And that gave us momentum. So, it grew beyond me and my neighbours. We had other people from across the city wanting to join because they could see, particularly after August 2024, that, racism was rising across the country. And because of the rise of the far right, because of the kind of stuff, people feeling that they needed to do something. So, since then, we distributed thousands of posters across our city, but we've been doing much more than that. We've become far more organised. We've been running organising workshops because fundamentally we believe that we have to build community at a local level, that there are real issues affecting our communities around housing, around, child poverty, cost of living crisis, and that they've been happening for a very, very long time. And within those spaces, we've got far-right groups organising and, blaming migrants for those problems. And we know that the reason why they blame migrants is so that people don't blame the politicians who are serving the interests of millionaires and those profiteering from the crisis. So what we're trying to do is work within communities to address those issues and build relationships between neighbours, because we believe it began with me and my neighbours. This has to begin with neighbours, people on your street, reaching out to each other, addressing, concerns. If you've got elderly neighbour who's isolated, or you've got people on your street that are struggling, how do we provide food in those spaces? How do we make sure our neighbours are okay and build relationships at local level and get people to understand that the problems they face is not because of migrants. It's structural problems created by politicians. So we're trying to do some of that organising work. But also, we have been campaigning against the flags. And the reason why that's important is because more and more we are hearing from people who are reaching out to us saying, there's flags down my area and it's making me feel really scared. And then, as well as a flag, there was an increasing number of attacks we were hearing about. As I mentioned right at the start of this podcast, there were two Asian women that were raped on the outskirts of Birmingham. Horrific rapes, but they were racially motivated. Racist abuse was hurled at their victims. We were hearing about attacks in parks, women saying to us they're too scared to go to parks because of attacks. And just generally how the flags were making people feel. And the whole Raise the Colours came from Birmingham. It came from the outskirts of our city. So we felt that we needed to address that and kind of challenge that. So we started a petition to ask our city council to remove those flags. And we got over 4,000 signatures. Attaching flags to public lampposts is an offence. And so far, our city has been very, very slow to respond to that. But we've been in talks with the council and the police who have told us that their officers have been intimidated and abused for removing flags. And so they've had to tread carefully, but now they've got police protection to do that. And that just shows, the fact that the police are having to protect people, council officers, who are removing those flags because it's against the law, shows the violent movement that Raise the Colours is. But beyond that, we've also, with local elections, we've been canvassing all the candidates in the local election and get them to sign a pledge that if they get elected, that they will stand up against hate and racism. And we've had, I would say, a quarter of all candidates sign the pledge. And a lot of them now have been elected as councillors, have committed to standing with the campaign and supporting our campaign asks. So we're far more organised than we were. We're not funded because we want to be able to, if you become a charity, you can't speak about reform. you can't call out political groups, but we want to make sure we're able to kind of name, what the problem is. And, we've been campaigning against reform in our city because we believe that reform are racist. They peddle racism, that they won't serve the interests of the people whose votes they want. They don't have proper policies. All they have is, blaming. And we know, as you said, is that the reason why they blame migrants is to distract from the real causes of the problems. So they won't fix the problems. All they're doing is stirring up racism and hatred. And that's a really dangerous road they've taken us down. And we're seeing the consequence of that. In one of the areas which has been flagged, the local mosque has been attacked 3 times. And, I've been in touch with that mosque and they're really, really scared. And that's happening across our city. So we were organising to challenge that climate of fear and to stop the division in our city. And unfortunately, Reform have, won 22 seats. And so, we've gone on record to say, we are going to double our efforts just to make sure that they don't harm the unity of our city. And it's just, for us, what's heartening is just the amount of people that have wanted to join us. This was something that me and my neighbours started just because, we received this poster, but now it's become a citywide campaign. We've had people who are social media managers join us to help set up an Instagram page. Some of our posts have gone viral. We've had a graphic designer volunteering with us. And these are people reaching out to us and saying, what you're doing is amazing. Can we come and volunteer with you? I never imagined we'd be doing this, but we're living in dark times. But I feel hopeful because I'm coming across so many people who are equally concerned, equally angry and wanting to do something. And for me, it's finding those people and us working together to challenge, the hatred.
And going back to America, you can see there quite recently that the Supreme Court are after rolling back some of the voting rights, which is just 2026. It's bewildering to see how that's even possible. And it's so blatant. And everything that they're trying to do to redistrict particular parts to change the political shape over there in favour of the racists. Let's be quite honest about it. It sounds to me, Moz, that the work that you're doing that did start at 2022, it's like now's the time to even dig in even more because the far-right voices seem to be very well funded. When you have some of the names coming up, and even in an Irish context, when you see random issues being hijacked by far-right groups outside of your own country. For example, in Ireland, we had, a bit like the UK and everything else, we had the escalating fuel costs because of Trump's stupid, idiotic war in Iran. So costs are going up. There was a big protest by the truckers and the farmers that was very, very quickly joined by the far-right crew. When you have the likes of Tommy Robinson, isn't his name, let's be clear about that. He even has to hide behind an anonymous name. But him posting about Ireland, in support of these protests, just trying to, I think they'll hijack anything at this stage. It doesn't matter what it is, and they care about little, but they care about just disruption and everything else for some weird agenda and everything. So it's important to keep going, and if that movement can expand to other cities. So for anyone listening, if they'd love to take a page out of your copybook and maybe copy some of the things that you're doing, where can they follow you, online? Where can we go to see those specific things? You might just name out the different social media platforms where you live and we can follow your activities.
So we're on Instagram, so find us at Brummies United. We have a Facebook page as well, Brummies United Against Racism. Or you can just email us, which is at brummiesunited@gmail.com.
And Muzz will reply to your email as I discovered.
Yes, yeah, we'll reply to emails or messages or DMs. And if you want to support us, because we are reliant on people donating to us to be able to carry on this fight. We've got a GoFundMe. Just look for Brummies United Against Racism. We really would appreciate any amount of donation, because we are distributing material free across our city, but that takes money, and organising takes money, and we don't want to, I think what history has taught me, and really going back to the beginning of the story, is when I was at school, I began to learn history to understand why I was here. And I learned history, and I learned how racists need to divide people. They've always done that. And our strength is when we come together. And I've learned that, history has taught us that, from the civil rights movement to the women's suffragette movement, is when people come together, we are far more powerful than money power. But we have to organise ourselves, and we have to organise our own money, and we can win. And history is full of examples of good people winning, good over evil. And I think we can. I think we can win over the Trumps and the Farages and the Andrew Tates. And there's a lot of misogyny and the homophobes. We can win, but we have to, unite and be together. And so I think for me, it's finding those people and living in that hope, because we have to hold on to that hope, and a lot to be hopeful about, because people are fighting back and resisting, and our future depends on that. So, use our example. We'll happily share any material with people, and let's not let them win.
Yeah, totally. And I think that is the big lesson that I learned from you, is that there is power in numbers. There's power in people coming together. But I think a lot of the time people aren't used to all of that organization stuff. Maybe unions and all that kind of thing aren't as powerful as they used to be. We're not used to coming together. And you've just demonstrated very simple ways of doing that. And we have all of the tools like our WhatsApp groups and our social media accounts. You're on the Win Happy podcast, Muzz. What's happiness to you?
Happiness is finding good people, your tribe, people who believe in the same things as you and are willing to fight for them and stand by you.
Oh, wow. And winning. So if I put winning alongside with that, at this stage now for you, and I always talk about, I'm not sure if you're a sporty person or whatever, but if you love playing football, there's a great sensation when the ball hits the back of the net, that those moments of elation. What does winning look like for you?
It's when your teams hit that goal and you turn around to each other and you hug each other, and that's a collective win. It's not an individual win. For me, it's your team winning, and the team for me is humanity, and that's why I believe that I may have experienced an injustice, but until, in the words of Nelson Mandela, is our injustices are incomplete unless other people's injustices are also won. And I've learned that, and so for me it's like we all have to win.
It would be lovely to just remove the oxygen from these hate groups, and I think what you're doing, addressing the problems, and for them to see, or for the general public to see, that we're addressing these problems, quite publicly and quite openly. So enough of your nonsense about saying that all of these things are our fault or whatever, and using that as this currency that we were talking about. On the podcast, I'm fascinated when I chat to people about the changes they make in their lives to bring them closer to happiness. What was the biggest choice that you made in your life that brought you on that happiness path?
That I was going to put myself out there. That I was no longer going to be the scared school kid. That I was going to step up. That I was and I am my own liberator, and that means stepping up and taking action and inspiring others to take action. And the only way you do that is by doing it yourself. So you have to walk the walk. And, and it's scary. We started this podcast by me saying, don't say my full name. But I'm still putting myself out there because I want to show people that, we have to stand up against injustice. And that can be really scary. I was never brought up being told to stand up against anything. I was shy, reserved, no friends, but I'm trying to stand up and getting other people to see that they can stand up and we can collectively make a difference. And it's a beautiful space. When you're standing alongside people and there are many, many people who are willing to stand up and be allies, it's just so heartwarming. Yeah, so, hope, and it gives people hope, and hope is something that the enemy doesn't want us to have.
Yeah. Well, there's loads of hope, and I'm so sorry that you had to put up with those terrible times in school, and that there were teachers who thought that was a way to look after the children that were put under their care. It's horrible. I wish I had been your buddy and in your class in those days. I wish I was there to hang out with you and to learn from you. And I wish I'd met your dad. Sounded like he had that little bit of grit that he passed on to his daughter 100%. And I know you said he left us 6 months ago, but he hasn't left anywhere. He is kicking and screaming inside you and lives on inside you. So that's wonderful. Most thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Greg. And I really wish you had been my friend at school too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take it easy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.